In 1917, as the United States prepared to enter the Great War, it possessed an army that was, in one specific area, considered among the most professional and technically advanced in the world. They were the soldiers of the U.S. Army Coast Artillery Corps. For decades, they had been the silent guardians of America's shores, an elite force of engineers and mathematicians trained to operate the most powerful weapons in the nation's arsenal. The massive, coastal defense guns that were hidden in concrete fortresses from Maine to California. They were masters of a complex science, trained to hurl enormous, armor-piercing shells with pinpoint accuracy at enemy battleships miles out to sea. They were ready for a battle that had been anticipated for a generation. There was just one problem. That battle never came. The German high seas fleet was blockaded in the North Sea, and no enemy warship would ever threaten the American coast. As the real war, a brutal, grinding land war of mud and artillery, raged 3,000 miles away in France, these highly skilled soldiers found themselves guarding empty oceans. They were a perfect weapon for the wrong war. This is the hidden story of the American army that was trained to be obsolete. It's the tale of how thousands of America's most technical soldiers had to forget everything they had spent their careers learning, travel to France, and be retrained from scratch by weary French veterans to fight a completely different kind of war. This is the story of how the Guardians of the Coast became the heavy hitters of the Western Front. The U.S. Army Coast Artillery Corps had its roots in the late 19th century. Following the Spanish-American War, a massive fortification program led by Secretary of War Elihu Root established a modern, integrated system of coastal defenses. All around the United States, at the entrances to major harbors like New York, Boston, and San Francisco, colossal concrete fortresses were built, armed with state-of-the-art artillery. These were not simple cannons. They were complex weapons systems. There were massive 12-inch guns on disappearing carriages that would rise up to fire and then drop back down behind a concrete parapet to reload, safe from enemy fire. There were rapid-fire 6-inch guns to deal with smaller, faster ships. And there were giant 12-inch mortars, capable of plunging a half-ton shell directly onto the thin deck armor of a battleship. To operate these weapons required a special kind of soldier. The men of the coast artillery were not typical infantrymen. They were highly trained technicians. They had to master complex mathematics, including trigonometry and calculus, to calculate firing solutions. They used sophisticated optical rangefinders, plotting boards, and electrical communication systems to track a moving target miles out at sea and land a shell on it with incredible precision. They were, in essence, the rocket scientists of their day. They trained endlessly, drilling their procedures until they were second nature. They were a proud, professional, and deeply competent force, ready to defend America from any naval threat. They were a perfect solution to a 19th century problem. But the 20th century had delivered a completely different kind of war. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, the Army's leadership faced a massive crisis. The war in France was an artillery war. Battles were won and lost not by infantry charges, but by the sheer weight of high-explosive shells. And the American Expeditionary Forces, the AEF, had almost no heavy artillery of its own. American industry, unprepared for a major land war, could not produce modern heavy field guns in the numbers required. General John J. Pershing, the AEF's commander, knew that without heavy artillery, his divisions would be slaughtered. The solution was pragmatic and humiliating. The Americans would have to use French-made guns. The French agreed to supply their excellent 155mm GPF field guns and other heavy pieces to the arriving American divisions. But this created a new problem. Who would man these guns? Operating heavy artillery requires a high degree of technical skill and mathematical knowledge. You couldn't just take an infantryman and put him behind a heavy cannon. It was then that someone in the War Department had a brilliant idea. They had thousands of highly trained artillery experts already in uniform, sitting in their coastal forts, guarding against a non-existent enemy. The men of the Coast Artillery Corps were the only soldiers in the entire U.S. Army who already possessed the core mathematical and technical skills needed to operate heavy artillery. And so, a momentous decision was made. The Guardians of the Coast would be stripped from their fortresses and sent to France. The army trained to fight the last war would be retrained to fight the current one. For the soldiers of the Coast Artillery, the news was a shock. These were career men, many of whom had spent their entire service in the clean, orderly world of a coastal fort. Their lives were a predictable routine of drill, maintenance, and training. They were masters of their concrete and steel domains. Now, they were being told to leave it all behind. They were formed into new, provisional regiments of heavy artillery and began shipping out to France in the summer of 1917. What they found there was a world of almost unimaginable chaos and squalor. They were sent to French artillery schools, often in muddy, makeshift camps, for a crash course in a new kind of warfare. The culture shock was immense. They had to forget the complex procedures for firing at a moving ship from a fixed fortress. Instead, they had to learn the grim science of the Western Front. They were taught by weary, veteran French instructors, many of whom spoke no English. Through translators, they learned how to camouflage their gun positions from enemy aircraft, how to calculate firing data for a stationary target they couldn't see, and how to live and work in a sea of mud. They had to learn to use unfamiliar French equipment, with instructions and markings written in a language they couldn't read. The greatest lesson, however, was psychological. In their coastal forts, they were protected by dozens of feet of concrete and earth. On the Western Front, their only protection was a hastily dug gun pit and a camouflage net. The German artillery was a constant, terrifying presence. The enemy had their own expert gunners who specialized in counter-battery fire, using sound ranging and spotter planes to locate Allied gun positions and then obliterate them. A coast artilleryman who had never been under fire in his life now had to learn to do his complex mathematical calculations while German shells screamed overhead, knowing that a single direct hit could mean instant death for his entire crew. But despite the shock, they adapted with incredible speed. Their years of technical training gave them a massive advantage. While it might take months to train a new recruit from scratch, these men already understood the principles of ballistics and gunnery. They just needed to learn a new application. They proved to be exceptionally quick students, earning the respect of their French instructors. One French officer wrote in a report, "The American artillerymen are remarkable. They learn in a week what it takes our own men a month to grasp. Their mathematical knowledge is superb. They are not amateurs." As they completed their training, the new American heavy artillery regiments were sent to the front. They were a strange sight. They were U.S. Army soldiers wearing American uniforms, but they were armed with French guns, firing French ammunition, and often using French maps. The first major test for many of them came in early 1918, when they were assigned to support the 1st Division in the Somerville sector. It was here that they fired America's first artillery shells of the war, a symbolic moment that marked their official entry into the fight. But their true value would be proven in the great battles to come. A special group of these men was assigned to an even stranger and more powerful weapon, the railway gun. The U.S. Navy, in a rare act of inter-service cooperation, had sent several of its massive 14-inch naval guns to France. These colossal weapons, designed for battleships, were too heavy for any normal carriage. So they were mounted on specially designed railway cars. They were, in effect, mobile superguns. Moving these behemoths was a logistical nightmare, requiring special tracks and locomotives. But their power was awesome. A single railway gun could hurl a 1,400-pound shell over 20 miles, far beyond the range of conventional artillery, allowing them to strike critical targets deep behind the German lines like railway junctions, supply depots, and command headquarters. And the only men in the entire AEF with the experience to operate guns of this immense size were the former coast artillerymen. They had traded their concrete fortresses for fortresses on rails. When the German spring offensive erupted in March 1918, the American heavy artillery regiments were thrown into desperate defense. And when the tide turned in the summer, they became the backbone of the great Allied counteroffensives. At battles like Château-Thierry, Saint-Mihiel, and the final, brutal Meuse-Argonne offensive, the American heavy guns played a decisive role. They provided the crushing firepower that smashed German defensive lines and silenced enemy artillery. An American infantry officer from the Meuse-Argonne wrote about the effect of his heavy artillery support. "We would be pinned down by a German machine gun nest in a concrete pillbox that we couldn't touch. We would get on the field telephone, and a few minutes later, the world would erupt. You would hear the shells coming in, a sound like a freight train in the sky. Then the pillbox would simply disappear in a cloud of smoke and dirt. Those big guns saved our lives every single day. The men who were firing those guns were the same men who, just a year earlier, had been sitting in coastal forts, practicing to fight a naval battle that never happened. They had transformed themselves from the guardians of an empty ocean into the masters of the most brutal battlefield on Earth. Their journey is a powerful story of adaptation. It reveals a hidden truth about military readiness. Sometimes, the most important skill is not mastering a specific weapon, but possessing the underlying knowledge that allows you to master any weapon when the time comes. The Coast Artillery Corps was trained for a war of mathematics, precision, and technology. And while the context of the war changed dramatically, those core skills remained essential. After the war ended, the Coast Artillerymen returned home. Their story, however, was largely forgotten. The glory went to the infantrymen who went over the top, the pilots who dueled in the sky, and the Marines who fought at below wood. The story of the technical soldiers who had to forget their entire careers and relearn their trade in the mud of France was too complex, too nuanced for the simple narratives of victory. But their contribution was immeasurable. Without the heavy firepower they provided, the American offensives of 1918 would have been far costlier and perhaps even impossible. The story of the Coast Artillery in World War I is the ultimate hidden front. It is a tale of an entire branch of the military that was, through no fault of its own, completely obsolete on the day war was declared. But instead of fading into irrelevance, they adapted, they learned, and they transformed themselves into one of the most critical components of the American war machine. They proved that the most powerful weapon an army possesses is not its guns, but the intelligence and adaptability of its soldiers. They were the American army that was trained to fight the wrong war, but in the end, their skills proved to be exactly what was needed to win the right one.